Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here, and it is wonderful to see you all for our very first lecture of 2020. Very exciting. It's been a little while since most of us have gathered, but I'm fairly certain you know what I'm going to say next. Yes. Yes. Please turn off anything that beeps or barks or, plays music or whatever. So it's only a week into the new year, but there's still time for you to make and keep resolutions, and I hope this year you'll resolve to spend much more time at Hillwood, and it's going to reward you because it will be a truly spectacular year. As many of you know, we close a few weeks every January to tackle some larger projects in the mansion. And so this week is your last weekend to explore Hillwood before February. So this whole time of being closed is very, very important for Hillwood because it's sort of one of our, it's a very special thing about Hillwood that it is so gorgeous and it is always sparkles. And part of the reason it does is because we deep clean, just like I know we all do in our own homes every year. But so we need to get it to really sparkle before we prepare for a very busy spring. So we leap back into action on Saturday, February 1st with the annual Crêpe Day, which is a French holiday that celebrates the halfway point between winter and spring. So visitors of all ages enjoy this program, and we explore our French collection. We have special focused gallery talks. You can decorate a Sèvres plate, and of course you can eat crepes. There's nothing wrong with that. February is also home to a perennial favorite, and I know a lot of you already know about this, the Great Homes and Gardens series. And we gather, of course, each week in February. We escape Washington's dreary weather, and we look at a lot of incredible homes. This year we start with Tony Duquette's Dawn Ridge, which Hutton Wilkinson will talk about. And then we look at the fabled gardens of Long Island's Gold Coast, Madam Walker's Villa Lewaro, and elegant designs throughout the world with Timothy Corrigan. So there will be an email, as you know, that goes out next week promoting the series. And I'm sure a lot of you know that 3 hours after that email goes out, the lecture series is sold out. So I'm giving you advance word, so you can reserve your seat today. Everything's on the website. And so you only have yourselves to blame if you wait. So I'd also encourage you to save a little room on your dance card for our annual Valentine's event, which is also the opening of our newest exhibition, Natural Beauties, Exquisite Works of Minerals and Gems. And you'll be rocking your best rocks at Romancing the Stone, which is what it's called, and it's on Thursday, February 13th. And of course, tickets for all of these things are available on Hillwood's website, or you can stop by the front desk tonight. So it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, although I think many of you know him very well already. Dr. Wilfried Zeisler is Hillwood's chief curator. He's a graduate of the Sorbonne University and the École du Louvre, Paris. He has written extensively on French and Russian decorative arts. He's the curator of the upcoming exhibition, Natural Beauties, and of course, he was the curator for Bauca de Vries, War and Pieces, which remains on view in the dining room until April. He also was curated Fabergé Rediscovered, and of course, wrote the majority of that catalog. Konstantin Makovsky, the Tsar's Painter, from 2016. And Splendor and Surprise, if you can remember back, all the way back to 2015, I think that was his first exhibition here. He contributed to Friends in Fashion, An American Diplomat in 1820s Russia in 2017, and also to The Artistic Table in 2018. Tonight's lecture is drawn from the chapter Wilfred wrote for the catalog of the Versailles Revival exhibition to which Hillwood sent loans, and it is on display in Versailles through mid-March. So if you're inspired, you can buy your plane tickets and run over and see it. Please join me in welcoming Wilfred Zeisler.
Thank you very much. So let's start. That there is an interest for French culture, French art, and French historic figures such as Marie Antoinette in America, that's no news. Still, I will try to tell you a bit more about that tonight, and also how this actually interest inspired Marjorie Post collecting. A couple of years ago, in Washington, D.C., an exhibition called America Collects 18th Century French Painting had already demonstrated this interest in the US. And in one of the sections of this exhibition, you had two women who were featured through these two portraits. One on the left, with this blue dress, is Anna Thompson Dodge, whose collection of 18th century French art can be seen in Detroit. And on the right, you had the photo of Marjorie Post wearing a costume of Marie Antoinette. So those two figures illustrate how 18th century France, 18th century French women, and Versailles were a source of inspiration for American collectors. Anna Dodge is actually in this painting featured as Madame de Pompadour was in this Boucher painting in the center. And Marjorie Post, as you can see here, is wearing this costume during for a ball at Palm Beach in 1923. This fashion and this interest for the figure of Marie Antoinette and Versailles and French 18th century didn't start in the US, but in France. And one of the figure who supported and developed this interest for Marie Antoinette and Versailles was Empress Eugénie of France, the wife of Napoleon III. So during the second half of the 19th century, Empress Eugénie developed this taste for Marie Antoinette, and she was herself a collector of pieces that belonged to the Queen. In 1867, she actually patronized a special exhibition organized at the Petit Trianon. This is the building you can see on the left on this slide. Petit Trianon was one of the favorite home of Marie Antoinette in the Park of Versailles that sort of epitomized the lifestyle and the design that had developed the Queen of France in the 18th century. And of course, with the French Revolution, a lot of furniture had been lost from this castle and from this house. And in 1867, the idea was to refurbish Petit Trianon with some furnitures and objects that belonged to Marie Antoinette or which were from the period of Marie Antoinette. And among the objects that were used to furnish this room and these spaces in the Trianon, you had actually one piece which is today at Hillwood, so one of the Riesner commode, which had been lent to this special display by Lord Hertford, the founder of the famous Wallace collection in London. And this commode by Jean-Henri Riesner was a good example of the kind of names which were immediately associated at that time with the Queen Marie Antoinette. Riesner being one of the most successful cabinet maker of the late 18th century, who was known for these very luxurious pieces of furniture made of wood marquetry enriched with gilt bronze, and which were part of what was considered the achievement of the style, which was appreciated by Queen Marie Antoinette. This fashion, of course, was not only demonstrated through this exhibition, but also in the interiors that Empress Eugénie was living in in France. So, for example, she will have her own apartment furnished with 18th century pieces of furniture or objects that some of them belong to Queen Marie Antoinette. On the left, you have one of her rooms of Empress Eugénie at the Castle of Saint-Cloud in a suburb of Paris. The Castle of Saint-Cloud was very important because it had been one of the gifts of King Louis XVI to Marie Antoinette right before the French Revolution, and she had it completely refurbished and redecorated in the latest fashion of the 18th century, right before actually the French Revolution. And of course, many of the furniture had been sold after the French Revolution, but when Empress Eugénie refurbished it, she would use some of the furniture which originally was part of the royal collection, including this set of 18th century French furniture which had been made for Queen Marie Antoinette. But as you can see, they were all covered in the most latest fashion of the 19th century with fabric and very comfortable, chairs here. And she will also have this desk, which was one of the most famous desks in the history of furniture. I will show it to you later, which was the desk of King Louis XV that she had in her study in Saint-Cloud. That castle doesn't exist anymore. It was actually destroyed during the war in 1870-71. So this style that was developed and patronized by Empress Eugénie, very inspired by the style of the time of Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette, was sometime at that period called Louis XVI Impératrice, or Louis XVI Empress, in relation to Empress Eugénie. The fashion was also to wear for masquerades and balls costumes inspired by 18th century fashion and 18th century dresses, and especially costume of Marie Antoinette. And here you have an example of this famous portrait by Franz Xaver Winterhalter, which is at the Met in New York, featuring Empress Eugénie wearing one of these costumes inspired by 18th century models. So, as often what was fashionable in France became fashionable on the other side of the Atlantic here in the US. And one of the most extravagant example of this success, especially in fashion, was actually a ball which was given for the High Society of New York on January 31st, 1905. This ball was organized by James Hazen Hyde, who was a businessman, a philanthropist, a Francophile, and an art collector. He's featured in the center of this slide as a French dandy, portrayed here by a French artist, Théobald Chartrand. And as you can see, he's even showing off his Legion of Honor here, so meaning he has received it from the French government. So in 1905, he organized this amazing party. I have to maybe specify he was very wealthy, and this ball was directly inspired by the luxury, the lavish life of Versailles. It was organized in a restaurant which was a high-end place in New York on 44th and 5th Avenue, which was called Sherry's, and it was actually designed the building inspired, as you can see with this pilaster, inspired by Versailles itself. The theme of the ball was Versailles and the court of Versailles. Everyone had to wear 18th century costumes inspired by costume inspired by 18th century, and 600 guests were invited. Champagne, jewelry, $200,000 of that time were spent for this amazing party, and the sort of top of the main aspect of that party was that he had commissioned a special play, and all the stars of the world were featured in that play. And one was Réjeanne, the French actress, which came for this party, and she's featured here, arriving in the sedan chair, as you will do in the 18th century, to perform for this party. And here she is welcomed by the host in this space. This, of course, party made the headlines because of the money spent, because of the flowers, thousands of flowers, because of the famous people who went and were invited, but also because Hazen Hyde was accused to have paid part of it with not his own money, but the money of his company. And he had to fly to France before it was sort of like cleared, and actually that he could prove that he paid for it. But this is a good example of, how this fashion was very important in the US. But to make it even more fashionable, what is better than a ghost story? And actually, in 1911, two British who were visiting Trianon in Versailles, Charlotte Anne Moberly and Éléonore Jourdain, visited Versailles one day, and they apparently met the Queen. So they came across different people, and they actually thought they saw the ghost of the Queen Marie Antoinette. They published a book about this story, which was called An Adventure, and this was a sort of like bestseller, and especially was published in English, so had a big success in England and in the US, and it was part of the sort of like fashion and interest for Marie Antoinette and Trianon in particular. And I have to say, a very serious colleague of mine a week ago, when I spoke about him about this lecture, told me, "Oh yeah, I was in the attic at Trianon and I felt something." So who knows? But still, it was really part of this sort of fashion and interest and passion for Marie Antoinette and Trianon. And indeed, this story was of interest even for Marjorie Post, because she had in her library a later edition of that book, An Adventure, that she had collected among other books dedicated to Marie Antoinette. Speaking of Marjorie Post, Hillwood's founder, as many of you may know, she was born in 1887 in Springfield, Illinois, and in the late 19th century, with the growth of the family company, which was been founded by her father, C.W. Post, so the Postum Cereal Company, with the growth of the company and a wealth as well, so the family, meaning Marjorie Post and her father, began to travel abroad. They will go to Europe and even in Paris in 1900, where the company was featured actually in the World Fair in Paris, and most likely they will also visit the main places there and possibly also Versailles. So let's talk about how progressively Marjorie Post developed an interest for 18th century France, and specifically Marie Antoinette. Her first house actually was built in 1905 in Greenwich, Connecticut. It was built at the time of her marriage to Edward Close, a banker who was involved with the company, and here she also began to become sort of a source of interest for newspapers. And you can see how Marjorie Post here in 1905 makes the headlines and the front cover of the Fancy Town and Country, as you can see here, taken from her scrapbooks. And the house on the left is really very American in a way, was built so in 1905, was destroyed by fire in 1917. And when you look at the interiors, which we know through photography, they were like typically of that period, like a mix between Edwardian style, arts and craft, and aesthetic movement regarding design. So nothing very, I will say, special, but more like very typically of that period. But if you look closely to one of the room, this one specifically, which is also a reflection of the fashion of the time, you can see that some of the furniture are actually designed in the sort of Louis XVI style or late 18th century style, such as this table, these little stools here, and that display case. And a display case showing that Marjorie Post is starting to collect and to gather objects and present them in cases, as she will do more and more afterwards. But this is not really here that she will begin to collect really objects of the 18th century and related to Marjorie Post. It's only when she moved to New York. 1915, Marjorie Post and will progressively settle in New York, first by renting a house and then buying it in 1916 for $1 million. The couple acquired actually, were part very quickly of the high society. Here you can see Marjorie Post and her husband Edouard Close in the studio of Pierre Tartouet, a French-born artist who was successful in New York, not necessarily for its artistic talents, but who did the portraits of Mrs. Post and Edward Close, and you can see the portrait he achieved of her and how he's like actually finishing the portrait of her husband. So they were part of the high society, and as member of the high society, they had to settle on Fifth Avenue. So they will first rent and then acquire the house on the left, which was a mansion named the Burden Mansion, after the name of the first owner of this house. This house was built by Horace Trumbauer. Horace Trumbauer was actually an American architect, which is mostly known for having built many houses for the American high society, and especially a lot of houses inspired by French models, such as Trianon and other late 18th century castles. And here you can see two other houses, famous houses that Trumbauer built. This is one of these famous Newport mansion, the Elms, which was copied after a castle in the suburb of Paris, Asnières, the Château d'Asnières, which had been built for Edward Julius Bearwind. And then here, remember the slide I showed you, the picture of Mrs. Anna Thompson Dodge. So that was her house, which is now destroyed, Rose Terrace, which had also been built by Trumbauer, and which is also sort of inspired by Trianon. So Trumbauer built this house for the Burden, the one that Marjorie Post acquired, and this is more in the sort of like late 17th century, early 18th century style, very French in a way, with this sort of like contrast between the red color of the bricks and the white color of the stone for this architecture. The inside had been originally designed by the French interior designer Allard, who was very famous for having imported to the US the French style, and especially this late 18th century French style. But the interiors that we know through photography, and I will show you now, were actually completely redesigned between 1919 and 1920 for Marjorie Post by William Baumgarten and Co. William Baumgarten is actually not very known. It's the interior design firm, which was known mostly for the French tapestries that they had produced, but they are known for having designed a few interiors for the Vanderbilts in New York and other other members of the high society. So among the rooms, I won't show you all of them, but you can see of the Burden Mansion, you can see the sort of like influence of Trianon, Versailles, and 18th century French style. Here, what is really typical on the left, that was the ballroom. The ballroom was decorated in this sort of late 18th century French style with an excess of garlands, flowers, medallions with pastoral scenes. All that was also very colorful, as we can see from the piano from this room, which you still have at Hillwood, with all these scrolls and medallions. And the ballroom chairs we still have in the collection too, which were originally delivered by Baumgarten for this room, which are adorned in the 18th century French style with bow and arrows, as you can see. And that style, which is sometimes described as antique fleuri, so because of the excess of flowers and the inspiration of antique models, which was described as a style that Queen Marjorie really liked, and that is the sort of like style that you can find at Trianon, was a style that Marjorie Post really loved for her different bedrooms, and they're all decorated in the same way. And here you can see the same style for her bedroom that she kept from the Burden Mansion I was just talking to you about, to her New York apartment, the following house, on the Sea Cloud, her yacht, in the American Embassy in Brussels. And you can see how she moves her furniture from a home to another. Trianon here in Washington, D.C., and finally Hillwood, as you can see with this image on the right. So style that she really liked for her bedroom. The entrance of the Burden Mansion was a sort of statement about where you were, and that you had a direct connection somehow with French royals and Versailles, especially through a selection of a few furniture. One of the pieces of furniture which is not located today is actually this desk that you have in the center here of this entry hall. This desk is actually an exact copy without the top of the most famous piece of the furniture in the world, which is sometimes called the most beautiful piece of furniture in the world, which was the desk of King Louis XV. You can see on the top right at Versailles. This desk was delivered by Zeisler for the king and Urban, so two cabinet makers, but started with Urban and then finished by Zeisler, his pupil, in the 18th century for the King Louis XV, and had been like a symbol of, Versailles, the monarchy, and as such, it's one of the rare pieces of furniture which was not sold by the government after the French Revolution, went to the Louvre, and then back to Versailles, and it was so famous that actually many kings and rulers in the 19th century wanted to have a copy of it. One of the first to commission a copy of it was actually Lord Hertford, so for the Wallace collection. And then you had one made for the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, in Germany, one made for the Emperor of Russia, Nikolai II, one made for the King of Bavaria, Ludwig II. So this was one of the most famous pieces of furniture because it was a unique piece. You knew you couldn't buy it on the art market, so you had to ask the best artisans, the best cabinet makers to do a copy. And for those doing a copy was not doing a fake, was just to show how they were able to create as well as their ancestors, beautiful piece of furniture, masterpieces. And for the owners or commission, it was a way to have an amazing piece of furniture which had a whole story attached to it. And that's this copy that Marjorie Post had in her entry hall here. She had also other copies. Some of them are still in our collection, such as this piece of furniture here, this little table, which is also in a very typical late 18th century French style, inspired by models by Weisweiler, another cabinet maker who worked for Queen Marie Antoinette and the court at that time. And this piece is still in our collection. But in this, speaking of copies and fakes, which is not exactly the same, you still had something which is a very interesting story in this entry hall. This table, which is still in our collection, it's actually a very beautiful and interesting late 19th century, maybe early 20th century piece of furniture made of gilt wood with an amazing top, made of lapis lazuli and tiger eye, and you have also some amethyst pieces on that table. That table, we don't know exactly when and how, and it was acquired by Marjorie Post. We know she had it before 1922, but what's interesting about it, that someone at one point enhanced that piece by adding fake marks. So the piece is real, it's from the 19th century, but you add fake marks to make it to give it like a prestigious provenance. And these fake marks are marks of the castle of Saint Cloud during the reign of Marie Antoinette. So it was a way to say this piece belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette. So we don't know if it's how it was sold to Marjorie Post, most likely, but still she kept it and she liked it. But maybe because of this and other example, progressively, she will develop her interest by actually buying objects from the best dealers in New York, so to make sure that she will get the best objects. And buying from these dealers was a way to have a sort of guarantee of authenticity and right provenance. So that's how she started to collect, I will say, object related associated with French royals and trying to build a collection. And actually, that's very interesting because in 1917, so which is when she is settling in New York, she starts to make the headlines as a real collector. And I will quote you two excerpts from newspapers from January 1917 after a very important sale which happened in New York. Quote, "The sale brought to public notice a new collector, Mrs. Close," so Marjorie Post, daughter of the late C.W. Post of Battle Creek, Michigan, posthum and grape nuts fame, and now the owner of a new and handsome residence at 5th Avenue and 92th Street, who purchased a large Rubens and 3 other large canvases. End of quote. Another quote. "The feature of last week's sale were the knocking down to Mrs. Close of the large and showy Adoration of the Magi." And this is the piece we are talking about. So the photo is very bad because I took it. It is what it is. Now in a church, so it's hard. This is the Rubens they are talking about, which was the highest price at that sale, and Marjorie Post bought it, and that's how she began progressively to buy antiques and paintings and being recognized as a collector. And this painting she gave to the St. Thomas Church in New York City in 1924. You can still see it there. And that's what's in her library. And some of these paintings were actually featured in Burden Mansion in different rooms, such as the dining room, as you can see here in these two photos. And so the paintings are English 18th century, sorry. And this will be could be another story. Let's focus on France. But the furniture still are copies delivered by Baumgarten. So the table and the chairs are in a sort of like Louis XIV style. But still you have on the wall here two copies of directly copied after famous model by Riesner, which are now at Fontainebleau, and these are very fashionable models, and also had like the historic model had connection to the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, so they were also very important, but these were copies. So her interest for art and progressively buying objects. Let's put it this way: progressively, copies were replaced by authentic pieces she bought from dealers, and that was particularly you could see it in her new home. So in the 20s, the mansion she was owning, she was approached by a developer who offered to buy the mansion to build a new building on the top of which you will have a penthouse, which will become Marjorie Post's famous New York apartment. So she will keep her private entrance at 92th Street, which is right here, on 5th Avenue, and then basically she moved upstairs, like the mansion was moved up. So 3 floors, 54 rooms, some of you knew already the story, and all furnished with her treasures. Here you can see the entry hall. Actually, it's very similar to the Burden Mansion, but it's like following the same style, the same trend. New interior designer, not Baumgarten anymore, now French & Co. She will work with for a very long time, including here at Hillwood. And as you can see, because of the sort of story behind that piece of furniture, even it's a copy, she kept that, wonderful copy of the king desk here. But the chairs now, armchairs, are 18th century French, and some of them, they are now at Hillwood. And you can see also that the floors are covered with rugs. Rugs from the 19th century or even 20th century, but all made in the style of the Savonnerie, so which was the royal manufacturer in France, and inspired by 18th century models, some of them with royal connections. And all these rugs, actually, that was something that she really liked. All her floors were covered with rugs, including here at Hillwood. And one of these Savonnerie style rugs is still on view today in the French drawing room. And this one is actually was delivered for Hillwood originally, is from the 19th century and most likely from the 20th century, was delivered by French & Co., but was inspired by one of the 93 rugs that Louis XIV commissioned to cover the gallery at the Louvre. So the gallery was about 1/4 mile long, and it wanted to have it completely covered by rugs, so he commissioned 93 rugs, each of these rugs were about 354-inch long, and all of them were like never actually installed there at the Louvre, but went to different locations, especially at Versailles and other castles, and they were so famous and such an example of Versailles and the style of the period that they were often copied. And on the left, so you have the original model, which is still in French, in France in the state collection, and then the copy that was used to create the rug that you have here at Hillwood. So among the works of art she will acquire in the 20s for the apartment and from very important dealers, you had paintings, of course. Here it's a view of the drawing room of the apartment, and on the left I wanted to focus on that painting by Nattier from the mid-18th century. Nattier was one of the most important portraitists of the court in the 18th century, and he created this portrait of the Duchess of Parma, who was a daughter of King of France Louis XV. As you have noticed, this portrait of the daughter of the king with her own daughter was a pendant of Marjorie Post featured by Julie de Blas in 1929 with her own daughter. So they are like a direct connection between the owner and the collector and, of course, the French royal family. And this painting was acquired through Wildenstein, who was one of the leader in the art market of historic painting at that time, so one of the very well-known dealer that Marjorie Post bought from. But the relation she developed at that time was mostly with Sir Joseph Duveen. Duveen was a very important art dealer. He was at the origin of some of the best collection of Western European art and French art in the US. Among his clients, you had Henry Clay Frick, you had Anna Thompson Dodge, you had Arabella Huntington, and he was a sort of mentor for Marjorie Post. We know that he would have preferred her to buy old masters, but she preferred portraiture, Sèvres porcelain, and French furniture with an aristocratic or royal provenance. And she began to buy objects from Duveen in 1926. And one of her first acquisition was actually this table, which is still in our collection. It dates to the 1760s, 1770s. And what's interesting about this table, even the provenance has not been verified, so who knows if it's true or not, but it has two labels which actually repeat twice the same story, which gives a sort of English provenance, which is most likely true, from an estate in England, and saying that originally it was acquired in the 1820s from the dealer Vacher in France, and that originally that table belonged to Marie Antoinette. So that's most likely one of the reasons why this piece was acquired, even we don't know if this provenance is true. But what's interesting about this table is that how it was displayed in the drawing room, actually very accordingly to the potential provenance, Marjorie Post put on the top of this table herself wearing a costume of Marie Antoinette. Other treasures that Marjorie Post bought from Duveen that same year in 1926. This is in the same room, but on the other side, on the other side, with the two tapestries, which are still here at Hillwood. So she bought from Duveen, from the Rothschild collection, these two amazing pieces that we unfortunately don't have in the collection anymore. Too bad. But these two amazing jewelry coffers are amazing pieces of furniture made by Martin Carlin, a French cabinet maker who was known for the use of porcelain plaques by Sèvres, which were inlaid on the woodwork. And the first, actually, of these coffers, which were a very famous model, was delivered in 1770 for Queen Marie Antoinette. And that one is now at Versailles. And 8 models are known today, and they are all based on the model which was made originally for Queen Marie Antoinette. And those two from the 18th century, from the Rothschild collection, were once part of Marjorie Post's collection. And fortunately, she gave them to her daughter, who gave them to Versailles. So another reason to travel to Versailles. So in this royal context of this drawing room, Marjorie Post is actually featured on this photo wearing one of her Marie Antoinette costume, and you can see she sits next to one of these jewelry coffer. And this was a costume which had a great success at a ball she attended in 1927 in New York. That's not the only costume she had several, and one other which is now featured at Versailles. So if you cannot make it to Versailles, here it's how it looks like. Marjorie Post is featured as the American example of the fashion of Versailles and the success of Versailles and of the figure of Marie Antoinette in the US through her costume, her photo, and the jewelry coffer, which is shown here with next to the dress. This dress was made for another occasion, a ball that was given in 1923 at Ogarcito, and in Palm Beach, and she's featured actually at Ogarcito wearing this costume, which was her first house in Palm Beach. And here again, another photo of Marjorie Post. You just saw it wearing another of her costume of Marie Antoinette. What I like about this costume, they are like inspired, of course, by 18th century France. They are not historically accurate, of course. And also, if you pay attention to some of the jewelry that Marjorie Post she's wearing, some of the jewelry, especially the bracelet or rings, they are very Art Deco, so they are very from the period. They are most likely Cartier pieces that she acquired at that time, but she was mixing, actually. She was not like trying to have 18th century jewelry or in the style of the 18th century with this costume. She was actually wearing her very fashionable jewelry. Another piece of furniture that she acquired at the same period, but not from Duveen, from another dealer, Simons, which is very less documented than Duveen, even though she bought far more from Simons in New York than from Duveen. Simons was originally an English firm, a dealer, who was established on Fifth Avenue in New York, sold a lot to other collectors, but it's actually not very well documented. So among the pieces she bought from Simons is this famous desk, which is now in the French drawing room. This photo showed it open. It's a work by Röntgen, the famous German cabinet maker who worked for the French court, for the Russian court, the Prussian court, who delivered furniture to Queen Marie Antoinette. And when it's closed, you can see actually a big monogram on the front of the desk, which is a monogram MA. And this Röntgen and this monogram has always been interpreted as being MA for Marie Antoinette, and it was sold as such to Marjorie Post. It was always considered as a piece of furniture which had been made for Marie Antoinette or which belonged to Marie Antoinette. It turns out that most likely this MA is not for Marie Antoinette but for Maria Antonia, who was Electress of Saxony. So which is still a royal provenance, but not the one that Marjorie Post thought it was. Still, it's one of our masterpieces of furniture, and it's an amazing work that Marjorie Post really loved, and she had it in her bedroom. In the New York apartment. You can see it here featured in this photo, again open. And what I like about this display is like it's set with that chair from a set that Marjorie Post acquired in the 1920s, which we know now are copies, but she might have bought them as originals, which have an MA on the back, which is for Marie Antoinette, and which are after a very famous model by the cabinet maker Demey, who created them. These are at Versailles, and these are the original ones were made for Marie Antoinette. So she used that desk every day, as she said herself, as I will tell you, and she will sit on this Marie Antoinette chair, writing on the Marie Antoinette desk, so in total communion with the Queen. And this desk on which she worked every day, as she said, was in her bedroom here at the apartment in New York, then at Trianon in Washington, and again at Hillwood until 1965, when she bought a new desk, the one you can see today in her bedroom, and then she moved it downstairs to the French drawing room, where that desk is now on view. But this desk, as you will see through this letter, was a piece that she really liked. In 1957, right after she was ready to move into Hillwood, she was sending some news to the director of Versailles, Mr. van der Kemp, and I will read what she's writing here on this letter. Quote, I have finally moved into my new house in Washington, and the address is 4155 Linnean Avenue. I guess you know this address now. This will now be a permanent address. This is going to be a joy to me because for the past 2 years since I divorced Mr. Davis, I have been living in hotels, which I dislike intensely. This new house is Hillwood by name and contains my French and Russian collections, both of which are quite extensive, as we all know. The beautiful desk of Marie Antoinette, which you know, always lives in my own bedroom, and I use it every day. So, end of quote. So clearly in 1957, she was still using it and working on that desk. But Marjorie Post's interest for Marie Antoinette was not only through her collecting and through works of art. She will also collect for her library and her self-education, like a lot of publication dedicated to Marie Antoinette and her life and the life in France at that period. Books in French, books in English. Some of them we don't know if they were from her time or if they were later acquired by the museum, but many of them for sure were in her own library. And one of these books, these are like some example of these different books, especially the one on the right is interesting because it's about, you know, the story and the scandal around the necklace of Queen Marie Antoinette and so on. But one of these books we know she owned because it has a sort of like writing in it from 1928. She got it in August 1928. It's actually that book from Madame Campan. Madame Campan was a lady in waiting to Queen Marie Antoinette and tells actually the story and of the life of Marie Antoinette and what happened during the French Revolution. And this book has two illustrations. One of the famous portrait of Marie Antoinette and her children, as you can see in the center, and of course, a topic of interest for Marjorie Post, a reproduction of the famous necklace of Marie Antoinette, which was so scandalous because of its value, and which is also featured in this book. And in this book, there is a story about, when Queen Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, during the Revolution, when they tried to leave France and they were arrested in 1791 at Varennes. So Madame Campan explained how Queen Marie Antoinette had saved some of her personal jewels and tried to leave Paris with some of her jewels, and that among these jewels that she had with her when she was arrested, you had a pair of earrings, diamonds earrings. And that book telling this story, Marjorie Post, got in August 1928. And in October 1928, what does she get? A pair of diamond earrings, so-called the Marie Antoinette earrings, which have been often actually associated with this mention by Madame Campan of these two earrings. We still don't know today if these two earrings actually one day belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette. But still, they are like both a total of 30 carats. They are now at the Smithsonian, were given to the Smithsonian by Marjorie Post's daughter, Eleanor Barzin. And these two earrings, of course, Marjorie Post bought them in October 1928 from Cartier, London. They had been sold to Cartier by the Yusupov family, who owned them since the early 19th century, and they had always said that they belonged to Queen Marie Antoinette. And they saved them from the Russian Revolution. I would like to say from a revolution to another. These earrings finally were saved from the revolution by the Yusupov, then sold to Cartier, and then finally acquired by Marjorie Post. And what I like about those that we have many photos, not necessarily photos, but paintings showing her wearing them as earrings. But only recently I found this painting of her wearing them differently. So in 1959, actually, she asked Harry Winston, the jeweler, to reset them. So on the center, you can see the historic setting of these two diamonds. So she had copies made in 59 by Harry Winston. And at the same time, she commissioned Winston with this famous brooch we still have in our collection with the big diamond in the center. And we were always wondering about a drawing that we had found in the archives showing actually two large pendants that could be attached at the back of this brooch. And actually, she had planned to have them worn with this brooch. And you can see on that painting how she's wearing a diamond necklace. On the center of the diamond necklace, you have actually the brooch, which is set with a diamond necklace. And then the two pendants you see on this painting are the two Marie Antoinette earrings. So she could wear them as earrings or as pendants for this as a necklace here. So this painting dates to 1961, and it's at the C.W. Post College in Long Island. These earrings were part of the different objects with a sort of like Russian connection that Marjorie Post began to acquire in the 1920s. So 10 years even before she didn't know that one day she will go to Russia and that one day she will fall in love with the Russian culture. So she was already gathering some objects because of their provenance with Russian connections. And these earrings, because of the Yusupov connection, the Yusupovs were some of the wealthiest aristocrats of Russia. So she began to have an interest for Russia. And indeed, she went to Russia, as you know, as the wife of the second American ambassador sent to Soviet Russia. And she spent a lot of time there, about 18 months. And she will also travel through Russia to Europe. She will fall in love with Russian culture, start to collect, and build her Russian collection. And I like one quote which says a lot about her, change in her passions. She collected postcards and photos from her trip to Russia, and when she goes and visit, some of the palaces around St. Petersburg, then called Leningrad, and actually, which is pretty interesting because some of the photos we have now document these palaces before, the damages and the destructions of the Second World War. And she says about Peterhof, quote, These are, I think, the most beautiful fountains in the world, not excepting Versailles. So, Versailles is gone. Now, Russia. Still, she will never, forget about Marie Antoinette and her interest for France. And actually, while antiquing and traveling in Europe in 1937, she will actually find a painting after the famous portrait of Madame Vigée-Lebrun. So on the right, this is a portrait by Madame Vigée-Lebrun from 1787, featuring Marie Antoinette and her children, which is at Versailles. And on the left, this is a copy after 1787 that Marjorie Post found in Paris in 1937, and she bought it, and which is actually the painting that was reproduced in the book by Madame Campan on Marie Antoinette that Marjorie Post owned since 1928. This portrait, which I like about that, it's a sort of summary of the vision that Marjorie Post developed for Hillwood afterwards, because this painting is French, about 18th century France, about Marie Antoinette, but came from a Russian collection, from the collection of the Academy of the Arts in St. Petersburg. Known as the collector, and especially of having two amazing pieces related to Marie Antoinette, Marjorie Post was approached in 1955 by Versailles for a Marie Antoinette exhibition, and she was asked to loan two pieces. And Marjorie Post and her daughter Eleanor Barzin, who shared the same passion for 18th century France and Versailles and Marie Antoinette, so were both patrons to this event in 1955 at Versailles. And among the loans, you had the two Marie Antoinette earrings, which were featured this way. This is an historic photo of the archives at Versailles, how this display was done of the jewelry. So they were lent to that show. And she lent the desk that at that time, they were still believed that it was once the desk of Marie Antoinette, and it was featured in the show, and that's a photo of the room where this desk was displayed in 1955. So, as I mentioned, mother and daughter share the same interest. And what I like about this slide is on the left you have Marjorie Post and her daughter Eleanor Barzin dreaming of Versailles in the 1920s, wearing an 18th century costumes for a ball in New York, and from the dream to the reality in Versailles in 1955 in the theater of Queen Marie Antoinette for the opening of the show in 1955. Mother and daughter together. On the top right, Marjorie Post wearing her Cartier emerald necklace, so for the opening of this Marie Antoinette exhibition. And as I said, both shared the same passion. There were a lot of exchange of art between mother and daughter, and actually even Marjorie Post was now focusing more on Russia. Her daughter will help her or suggest her acquisition or give her object related to Marie Antoinette. Among them, there is the famous swivel chair from our collection, which was presented by Eleanor Barzin to her mother in around 1959. And this chair by one of the most famous artisans of the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. So is really a good example of the style of the period, and has a stamp of the private household of Queen Marie Antoinette, so has a direct connection to the Queen. Still, Marjorie Post was as I said, more focused on Russia. But she was still focusing on historic figures. And from, I will say, Marie Antoinette, she developed a new passion for Catherine the Great. Here she is on the stairs at Trianon in front of Catherine the Great. So from the new Marie Antoinette, she's now the new Catherine the Great. And her, so basically her interest for, these two historic figures, one French, was Russian, summarize, what Hillwood is, French art, Russian art. But it also shows that our collection is definitely dedicated to the women in the arts. Thank you very much. If you have a few questions.
Where is the portrait of Catherine the Great that wasn't Trianon?
Yes, where is the portrait of Catherine the Great, which was at Trianon? It's the one which we have on the stairs today.
Is it the same one?
Yes, it
Oh,
is.
it's so much clearer there.
Well, it's the magic of slides.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's so funny.
Are there other questions? Yes?
When she asked the jeweler to remake a piece, what type of fittings do they put on the back in order to be so invisible?
So the question is about jewelry and what kind of fitting they put on the back so that of jewelry so that they are so invisible. So,
Wrong question.
No. It was not really about question about jewelry, but the setting. You mean like they are set with very tiny sets of setting made of platinum or silver. Yeah, well, but they are like you have little not pins, but like the griff, but they are attached from on the front. So that's how they are set together. But sometimes you lose them, but they are supposed to be, secured with.
Because she was remaking things all the time.
Yes, yes. She always brought. It's very. It's often the case with this client or collector of jewelry that you will bring your old jewelry or your stones, and they will be reset to be always and reused to be like always sort of like in the fashion. And that's something which is really traditionally jewelry. And even in the 18th century, you will do that often. And even like some of the jewels that Queen Marie Antoinette, for example, commissioned, she will sometimes bring jewels from the crown jewels or her own personal jewels to the jewelers and ask them to set them in a special way, and then they will be reset differently, like for another opportunity or because the fashion had evolved. Yes?
How did you determine that what we used to call the Marie Antoinette desk was in fact not destined for Marie Antoinette?
So the question is about the round gun desk. How do we know it's not Marie Antoinette? So this is absolutely not my research. This is actually the conclusion that have been done after the round gun exhibition that was at the Met I think in 2011 or 12, where we sent the desk and then new research had been done. And it's the most likely the case, but there is it's just like the more recent attribution, but it's not definitive. But there is no proof that it was actually Marie Antoinette's desk. And I have to say that the furniture which were at Versailles or which belonged to Marie Antoinette are pretty well documented, and there is no trace of that desk, besides the fact that it's a monogram which doesn't look like the regular monogram you will actually have for Marie Antoinette.
Who was Maria Antonia?
Sorry?
Who was the person?
Maria Antonia was an electress of Saxony. She was a princess of Bavaria. So if you want more information about that, I really recommend you to look at the Rongan exhibition catalog.
Wilfred, I've got a question from the simulcast.
Okay.
Can you speak more about which president purchased the desk at the White House? That one that was frequently copied?
Oh, I didn't speak. Okay. So, like this desk, I don't, White House? Nope. The desk I should.
Send clarification.
All right, so the desk I showed several times, and that was copied, one copy without the top of the desk, which was owned by Marjorie Post and delivered to her for Burden Mansion by Baumgarten, is a copy, and many copies were made because it was a very famous piece of furniture. And that desk, the original one, is the desk that originally was made in the 18th century for King Louis XV, for Versailles, and it's still at Versailles today. Copies were made and commissioned for Lord Hertford at the Wallace Collection today in London. One for the King of Bavaria, Ludwig II, one for the Kaiser in Berlin, and one for Nicholas II. No White House. As far as I know, or it's maybe an ongoing commission, I don't know. Is there another? Yep. Sorry, yes?
Did Marjorie Merriweather Post speak French?
That's a good. Did Marjorie Post speak French? Speak French. That's a good question. I'm not so sure. Maybe I don't know. But it's a very good question. We will look into that.
Did I understand you to say now, of the two Reasoner chests in the entry, the one, if you're facing the library on the left, that was in the one in the more neoclassical style? The later purchase by Marjorie?
Yes.
Did I understand you to say we now believe that was a chest that was at Saint-Cloud in the apartments of Eugenie?
No. Maybe I was not very clear tonight. So there is a question about the commode I showed at the beginning of this presentation, a commode by Reasoner. So this is actually the one which is on the right when you enter the house, and this was a piece which was part of the collection of the Wallace collection, and this actually was, when it was part of the Hertford collection, was lent to the Petit Trianon in 1867 for this display that Empress Eugenie organized to commemorate Queen Marie Antoinette. So it was a loan to that special display. Yes, but it was never part of Empress Eugenie's collection. And the two Reasoner type commodes I showed, only in black and white, in the New York, in the Burden Mansion, those two were copies, and we don't know where they are today. But these two were after a model which is now at Fontainebleau.
Sorry, Wilfred, just to clarify, they never went to the Wallace collection, they went to Louie Lafitte.
I know, but I'm saying like they are from Lord Hertford in Paris, who actually is the founder of what's known today as being the Wallace collection. Yes. But, no, I know. Yes, sorry.
When Eugenie and Napoleon III left in exile for England, did they take any of the furniture with them?
So when Napoleon III and Eugenie left France after the fall of the Second Empire, if they took some of the furniture with them, not so sure about that. I mean, they saved some of their jewelry, but they didn't have actually time to take too much of their belongings. So I'm not aware of much of furniture that was taken by them when they left France.
Thank you very much.